Today's guest is Sheremata. Here's our job talk with the journalist and communicator.
Welcome to the Job Talk podcast, where we talk with people who love their jobs. Our guests open up about their challenges, surprises, and secrets to success in their industries. Through conversation, we explore their careers, past work experiences, and the education that got them to where they are now.
Davis, I'm going to take you back in time to when you were graduating from high school. Did you know exactly what you wanted to do in life career-wise?
I had no clue whatsoever, Kim. I grew up in northern Alberta and I graduated from school, and my goal at that time was to get a law degree and then never practice and work as a richly credentialed bartender in the service industry. That was my goal. It was not a clearly defined one at all.
What kind of student were you in high school moving into university?
I was not bad in high school. I saw certain bad habits beginning to manifest themselves of procrastination and rushing to do a project and needing to rely on being brilliant, having a flash of insight and brilliance as opposed to an accumulation of hard work resulting in the success of a project that still continues to sadly manifest itself to this day in one form or another. You can safely say that I did not have a richly set out career path that would have resulted in long-term satisfaction.
Okay, so you graduated from high school, I'm guessing, with fairly decent marks. Where did you go to? What was your first post-secondary experience?
I enrolled in as you know, like I said, I wanted to be a lawyer. And so what I did was I went to the University of Alberta and I enrolled in the Bachelor of Arts program with an English major and a philosophy minor. And this was, at that time, it was in the late 1980s, and Alberta's economy was not doing well. We were still in quite a recession. And just a bachelor's degree was regarded at that time as pretty much the kiss of death for a career and rendering you pretty much unemployable. And so it was kind of understood at that time by me and my friends in the program that we would need to continue on to get a second degree in something. To be able to have really any shot at a meaningful career. But I found myself after about 4.5 years deciding that school was over, that I didn't want to practice as a lawyer, and I didn't really want to go to law school. I needed to think of something else. And so I kind of bailed, wound up with a 3-year degree, not a 4-year degree, a 3-year general degree, which was still available in those days. And then left school with no idea what to do. And I wound up getting a summer job that my parents helped me get at the Alberta legislature as a summer student. Working for the government caucus, just basically as an office assistant. And so I did that for 3 months, and then September rolled around and I had no idea what to do. And so I went back home and was trying to think of what to do. And this was one of the decisive moments in my life, because I grew up in a little community called Grassland, which is sort of halfway between Edmonton and Fort McMurray in central Alberta. And there was a large industrial project, the Alberta Pacific Pulp Mill, coming in. And they were looking to employ, a certain number of people from the community. And I was kind of told that, I had a university education of whatever quality, and that if I wanted to apply, I'd have a shot at getting a job. And I really wasn't. My parents told me, you don't need to stay here forever, but this is good, meaningful employment. It'll get you started on the way. And I kind of knew at that moment that if I stayed, I was going to wind up buying an expensive vehicle, getting a girlfriend, or at least optimistic that I would, and that you tend to stay where you are. And I was really concerned. I mean, at that point, I was like 22 years old. And so what I did was I wound up kind of heading back to the city and crashing on a friend's sofa while I tried to figure out what I was going to do, being, not especially employable. And I thought I was going to wind up pumping gas or something. And then the MLA that I had worked for, who represented the Athabasca-Lac-La-Biche constituency, the late Mike Cardinal, wound up calling and saying a job had opened up in the mailroom at the legislature and would I like to apply? And so I did it, and that basically enabled me to to get a foothold in Edmonton, making at the time I was told by the chief of staff I would make $1,700 a month. And that seemed to me to be, at that time, an absolute king's ransom. It enabled you to live on your own. And so I did it for a couple of years. And I wound up, I knew some speechwriters there at the time, and they wound up saying, why don't you try this as a job? You have an English background. They'd seen some little messages I sent. So I wrote a couple of speeches and communications basically on spec after hours on the computer in the mailroom. And that wound up being enough to let them give me a shot as a speechwriter, which I did for 3 years. And that really got me a foothold. And it was kind of exhilarating at that time. If a person hasn't been to their legislature or the House of Commons, you've got obviously the legislators sitting on the floor, and you've got the speakers gallery up top. And the first time I sat in the speakers gallery and not the speakers gallery, the public gallery, looking down as a representative was reading your words and they were being read into Hansard, and that they would live there, was really quite an exciting experience. And at the time, I was a firebrand, well, not a firebrand, but a young, pretty liberal, and I was working for the government caucus at that time, which was something that I was not politically aligned with at all. And it was really interesting working in a not entirely congenial environment with very long hair, and I was, which was not representative of them at that time. And just sitting there, it was a very unusual experience. It was a great start to the career. And walking into the legislature in the morning, in the rotunda there in Edmonton, it was just really cool. I really enjoyed it. I considered it to be a great start to my career.
I was just going to mention, so you're a writer, you're writing speeches. Did you ever have an idea that you wanted to become the politician that was saying the words rather than being the person in the background, being the writer?
Never. It's a very challenging life being a politician. You need to be a great balancer. You need to speak. You need to know when to speak, ingenuously and disingenuously. And the other thing I learned was that it was very clear. I told myself, if you want to work in this profession after the age of 30, you need to be open to the idea of running for office. And I never had any desire to run for office, and I had no illusions about my electability either, in terms of my ability to get people to vote for me. So that was just never an option. So leaving was a good, that was always going to happen. And so, and also politics is an extremely uncertain business. And I saw people that I knew who had been there for 20, 25 years. And suddenly, the light in the room changed, the environment changed, and they were gone through no fault of their own. It's an incredibly uncertain way to make a living. And it was nothing I had no illusions about staying in there for the long term. And so I wound up leaving, or being told to go when I was about 28 years old, with enough of a settlement to enable me to get a foothold in another thing. And I knew I wanted to, at that point, to be a journalist. I mean, you had the journalist gallery, and the journalists in the press gallery at the legislature. I looked at them; they were like rock stars, and there were some really good writers there. And I thought it would be really, really cool to do. And so even when I was a speechwriter, once again, I started doing the next job on spec. And so I volunteered for writing for free with this very small inner city paper called the Boyle-Macaulay News, which I'm not sure is still running anymore. It was just, there was just 2 or 3 very passionate staff who were working for free. and it was one guy who was mimeographing it in his office. And this is, like I said, this is located in the inner city of Edmonton, so very much serving the inner city community. And I called them, and they said, yeah, no problem at all. And so, yeah, my first ever journalism story, I still have a copy of it. It was on the front page, and I was covering, I think, like a flea market or something. And I was walking around reviewing the booths and the food. And I took it very, very seriously. Tried to taste everything, and then wrote, 600 words on it. And they ran it on the front page, and it was really cool. So I did that for a while, and then when I left the legislature, I wound up working for. I contacted, I think, a seniors, an Edmonton seniors newsletter, and seeing if they would let me write for them. And they said, yeah, and we'll pay you 5 cents a word, which seemed like a king's ransom, but was not very much at all. So I did a few stories for them. And then a friend of mine worked with a company that was doing advertising, and they kind of signed me on for a few months to sell and write ads and write a few feature articles. So I did that, and that kind of enabled me to get a foothold. And then, so I was basically working as a freelancer, not making a lot. And then this same friend said to me that he had heard about a history book project that was being done by a magazine called Alberta Report, which has a fairly notorious reputation, very right-wing publication, and not one that I agreed with very much, quite frankly. And they were doing I believe it was called Alberta in the 20th Century. So they were going decade by decade, writing a book about the history of Alberta. And he said they were looking for writers. So I contacted them, and they said, yeah, we'd be interested in come in, talk to us. And but then they said, we're not interested in really having you do that, but because you've got political experience, would be interested in covering politics for us. And I had no other options at the time, so that was kind of where I went with it. Very long story. I do apologize. I'm going to say one more thing, Kim, if I may, and you may need to edit this down for context, but I also had the biggest disappointment of my professional career, because when I was selling the ads, I wound up going out one night with the guy who ran the advertising company, and at the table that we were hanging out at was the current, at that time, I think the editor-in-chief of Canadian Geographic magazine, which I'm not sure is going anymore. But, a really cool publication writing about, land and culture in Canada. And we wound up hanging out, and my then girlfriend and I went on a trip for a couple weeks to Europe. And when I got back, the head of the advertising agency said to me, hey, this editor called you, and they're looking for a reporter to write for Canadian Geographic. And he thought of you. But I meant to give you the message like a long time ago. And so I called the guy, and he said, yeah, you would have been perfect, but we filled it. And so right at the beginning of my journalism career was a chance for a staff job with a great publication, writing for a monthly, and it, boom, fell in the ground. So my journalism career started with an absolutely abject, soul-killing disappointment, which I'm feeling right now as I say this. Which I've mostly recovered from.
What is your personality like? You mentioned you were a speechwriter in politics, and then you started to transition into being a journalist. Why you could easily, I don't want to use the word settle, but you could stay in that career for 30 years. What is it about you that you're continuing to build and go into the next phase?
Well, when I grew up, you thought of your parents' careers as being, you did the same job for 35 years with the same people, and it was very stable and everything. And my generation was, I think, the first one where you began to understand that you would not, that kind of employment was unusual, hard to come by, and if you weren't careful, could wind up being, as much of a prison as an opportunity. And I tried to be really, really aware of needing to kind of keep moving and keep developing. And I wound up working as a freelancer for about 5 years, mostly for Alberta Report, but I had, my byline appeared in Maclean's a couple times, in Reader's Digest a couple of times, which was kind of cool. But it was a very, very uncertain lifestyle. And my real dream at that time was to work for a daily and really, really chronicle the the news of the day in a breaking fashion, and really keep that, really be that. And I thought that would be the thing I would want to do for the rest of my career. And I wound up getting a call from a guy at the Edmonton Sun saying, we got an opening, why don't you apply? And so I started doing that. I think I was 32 years old, and I thought, I've arrived, I'm going to do this forever. And I found the rigors of being a daily journalist were incredibly challenging, because you were showing up for work and you had no idea what you were going to be doing that day. You might be, you could wind up at the scene of a murder, at a government office covering a press conference, at a sporting event, and you really had no idea. And so I had to put in a mental exercise, whereas I was walking up to the stairs to the newsroom every day, I would have to make my mind a complete blank, so I was ready for whatever. And I found that after a couple of years of doing that, it was really not for me. And the other thing is that you have no control over what you're doing. The external world is deciding what you're going to be doing and talking about that day, and that was really challenging. But it was good for my writing, because I learned you could write two or three stories a day if you had to, and get them in on time, and you learn to write clearly and quickly. And so that was a big get for me.
When you're writing for a newspaper, are you applying a formula to each story, or how does that work?
Well, you kind of know, right? That's one of the great things about a newspaper column, which is that you need to have basically the first paragraph exactly, who did what, why, when, where, and how, and why people should care. And so you learn to be really, really clear, and you try to, as when you get, decent at it, as people are talking and you're reporting on the story, you're already writing it in your head. And someone's saying, what the first quote's going to be, what the second quote's going to be, who's going to provide a counter argument, what the fact, And so it lays out, you're kind of laying it out, and then it's just basically a matter of typing it out really, really fast. And so, yeah, you're kind of doing it. There were people who were better at it than I was, obviously, but it was, it's something, it definitely comes down to, I don't want to say a formula, but certainly a familiar format. And the biggest thing I learned, which is that you never put key information in the last couple of paragraphs, because when a story goes into layout, you basically are told you have this many lines, and the format time I think was 51 or 31. So a banner story at the top was 51 lines, but you also knew that sometimes new information would come in at 8:30, and the layout would change. And often one of the ways they'd make room was by chopping paragraphs out of the end of your story. So if you had an important piece of context framing the way things were going to go, you had to not put it in the bottom, because that tended to be cut out. And so just certain things like that you kind of learned how to do.
Would you say, and this might sound harsh, were you burned out when you left the Sun?
Oh God, I was totally fried out. I was like, this is not for me. I had covered too much. You're kind of running on the line. I'd covered a couple of crime stories. I had a couple of death threats by that point. And one former MLA I worked out with said, if you haven't gotten a death threat in your job, what you're doing doesn't really matter. But I still didn't find that very comforting. So, and it's very difficult it's a very difficult profession. I really respect people who can do it over the course of an entire career and keep and maintain any sort of energy for it. But for me, I was ready to go. And so here I was 33, 34 years old, and I had already done the profession that I thought I would stay in. And at that age, I was kind of done with it. And so a friend of mine had heard about a job at NAIT, the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, located in Edmonton, as a writer. And the appeal of a 9-to-5 job where you knew what shift you were doing, reasonably predictable atmosphere, was very appealing at that point.
I was going to ask you what the most stressful part about being a journalist is, and I was thinking it might be deadlines, but I'm guessing death threats is probably the most stress of that job.
Deadlines are way more stressful than death threats are. Even though one of them was from a, it wasn't really a threat. It was more of a promise that if things went a certain way, that there was going to be a certain outcome for me, and that was you sort of accepted that as a fact of the job, but deadlines were very stressful. I'll give you an example of my most stressful moment really, really quickly. I was doing a story on we're going 20 years ago now. The Alberta government was working to settle a civil suit with Albertans who had mental challenges and who had been forcibly sterilized. And so obviously an absolutely heinous practice, and they were attempting to make good on it. And I had written a story that was going to line, so it was going to be the lead story. And with 7 minutes to go before deadline, so this is 9:30 p.m., I'm hanging around the newsroom, the story's already gone through, and then we got a call. The lawyers have reviewed your lead and the headline, and they killed it. You can't run it. So I had 7 minutes before we went to press to change the story. And then they had to change the front page headline over it. And so the entire newsroom stopped, and the head editor said, listen, can you find another lead? You got to rewrite the first 3 paragraphs of your story. You got 7 minutes. And if we don't hit this 9:30 deadline, the presses are an automated process, everything has to shut down. And the estimated cost at that time was about $70,000 to shut the presses down and restart them. So I'm sitting there flipping through my notebook, and I had the guy on the rim watching me, who's the initial editor, and you had the guy laying out the front page. And I had to think of a headline really quickly. And I said, how about this? And they said, no, how about this? And I told myself, stay calm. This is one of those moments, right? And so I found it. I said, how about this? And they said, yeah, that'll work. So I started writing, and they actually changed the computer screen so that all of the editors could see what I was typing as I was typing it. And everyone was watching as I banged it out. So I wrote a lead, a first quote, and a second and a third paragraph. And everybody was watching, and then they were building a front page around it. And I think we made it with about a minute and a half to go. And that was stressful. That was tough. It's one thing to exerting bravery in the face of something like a death threat is challenging, but having to think and produce something intellectually and write it and make words happen in a very tight timeline, I found that was challenging.
And everything that you're saying, I mean, you're truly learning as you go. So you take all of that experience, and then the stresses in your next job at post-secondary aren't at that altitude.
Not even close. I remember getting there, and I was writing a story for the alumni magazine, then called Alumnate. I'm not sure it's still going. And I was writing something towards the back with a program update. And I remember sitting at my desk and thinking, I'm not sure anyone's going to read this. Maybe 5 people. And I'm not sure they're going to worry about it. And I felt this liquid sense of relief go through me at writing something so just inconsequential. It was liberating at that time. It really felt safe and relaxing, and I didn't mind it. I knew I wouldn't want to do it forever, but it felt good. And by the way, I loved Alumnate. We wrote some good stories there. It was a very good publication, but it was good to be on board.
How long did you stay at that post-secondary?
So I was the writer for about 3 years, really liked it. So I was writing speeches, I was writing the monthly staff newsletter, writing communications and stuff. And then a spot opened up in our media relations person at that time left. And my boss said, hey, would you consider, you worked in the media, would consider doing media relations. And I really wasn't sure that I wanted to have anything to do with journalism again. But I said, sure. And so I did it for about a year, and it went really, really well. Like, you know, Nate, you've got 17,000 students going through there at that time. Lots of interesting people, lots of interesting programs and stories. And I found it, you know, it really was not challenging to you know, have stories come to you or find them and propose them to reporters. And it was very relaxing because, you know, once I proposed the story and they started writing about it, my job was sort of done. And I didn't have to write. I was always like, I don't have to write a story at the end of this. So it always felt really, really good. And the greatest success I had, we had a bunch of events one week. And at one point we wound up, we had the front page of the paper, a story on page A1, a story on page B1, which is the city section of the Edmonton Journal, and a story on, I think, E1, which was the business page at the same time. And I went and bought about 10, 15 copies of that paper. And I still have them. And that was just, Nate was an interesting place. It was great to work there. And it was, you know, I know you worked there as well at the time. And so there was just a lot of energy from, you know, you had new students coming in all the time. And it was just, you know, an educational environment. And I think that was the happiest I've ever been at a job. I actually loved working there.
Excellent. I want to speak in general terms with the next section of this podcast. Just talking about your role now. Don't get into specifics of who you're working for, but the type of work you're doing now, and then we'll get into can we call it a side project that you're working on?
No, it's the main project. But yeah, no problem. I'll try to walk everyone through it really fast. So after I left the AAR, I went into working in the oil and gas industry. I've worked for 4 companies. You know, basically doing media relations and communications. So doing interviews with reporters and everything. You know, writing press releases, you know, writing speeches, sometimes writing internal communications. So right now I'm actually leading internal communications and external communications for, you know, an oil and gas company. But just like every other job I've ever done, I kind of picked what I wanted to do next and started kind of doing it on spec. So for about 10 years from the time I first moved to Calgary in 2005, I worked on a book project that I wanted to do. And it was fiction, and I'd written some stories before, but I'd never quite wanted to publish them. And I went working on this book, which I considered to be a real project, and worked on it on and off, and did a ton of research on it. And about 3 years ago, so I had a couple hundred pages written, tons, oodles and oodles of research, notebooks filled, and kind of was always chipping away at it, but it didn't really have a finish point. And one day it came to me that, you know what, maybe this book isn't very good. Maybe that's the reason you haven't been driven to finish it. I was more doing it almost like a hobby instead of as a project with an endpoint. And I decided one critical day to stop doing it, to give up the book idea. And I was like, it seems very smart, but it's a little bit derivative. It was very influenced by an Argentinian novelist named Jorge Luis Borges, a very famous guy. A little pretentious, and just it's a better project to talk about than it is to actually read for the viewer. And so I gave it up. And I remember thinking, here I am for the first time giving up the next thing I'm going to do. So I'm doing a thing, but I have no next thing, and how's this going to go? And about maybe a week later, something kind of said to me that, there's a book coming in your head, and it's going to arrive over the next few days. And so I kind of put myself ready to receive it if that was actually the truth. And then I was actually doing the dishes one afternoon on the weekend, and over the course of about 6-7 minutes, the entire book rolled into my head, kind of from start to finish, including a title. And I was like, wow, that was interesting. And I kept doing the dishes and just stayed very, very calm about it. And that became the project that I was working on. And so I've been really working on it ever since. So the book is entitled Simultaneous, bit of a long title with a lot of, I think it's six syllables. But it's basically about an accountant named Michael who meets a computer programmer meets a computer programmer named Sophia, who is testing a project, a technology called Speak, that enables users to capture for a brief time a small segment of their consciousness and save it onto a file. And at the time I thought, this came to me, it was quite a novel concept. I since did some research and found that this isn't really that far off, that there are people who are working on similar things like this. The project was not appealing because anyone who has done this before, someone always wound up sliding a helmet and trodes on their head. And I thought, if someone's got to slide a helmet on their head, this thing is over. And I didn't even want to write it, much less anybody want to read it. And so I thought about it, and my critical mind was always thinking, I was like, if it's done with an earpiece, that could be charming enough. And it turns out a few months later, I read about a company that was actually trying to patent something like that, an earpiece that can actually capture kind of a segment of a brainwave over a certain period of time and save it. So it's not that novel. And there was actually a company I learned about. I did some research and found there was a company in the southern U.S. that sort of does something like this, where they are taking people who are suffering from advanced Alzheimer's and attempting to capture sort of their brain waves and then play it back to them to try to slow down the brain's eventual dissolution, which is which made me very sad. But at the time it was quite novel, and so I got to work on it. And I learned very quickly that the written format didn't really work. And one of the things that didn't really appeal to me, I've read what I think is a lot of fiction, and I've never quite been satisfied with the ability of black text on a white background, however formatted, to be able to put across kind of the spatter of a moment. Because eventually your eye is always going to go to one part, and it's very sequential. And you could linger over it for a long time. And I told myself, you know what, the book is going to not be a book. Why would this guy write a book? It's going to be a speak file with where the book comes to him the way it came to me, after the action is over, where it replays itself in his mind over several minutes, and that's the way it's going to be. So I got to work writing it, and I wrote about half of the book, about 200 pages worth, and always knowing that this was the wrong format, but I wanted to advance the story. And I was kind of thinking about it all the time. And then over one very troubled evening when I was thinking about this, I was like, this needs to not be a written format. This needs to be in a format that is mobile, that moves. And I had the idea of text disappearing and reappearing on a screen and only being present for a very short period of time, so that you can't reread it. You can only read it once and then it's gone. So it'd be the form of like a video with words appearing on it and then gone. Basically the way reality appears to us. Where it's there and then it's replaced by another thing, often very quickly, depending on what you're noticing. And the other thing the format had the ability to do was, be able to present two things happening at the exact same time. And you choose which one you're going to look at. And that sounded like a really good representation of choices that we're faced with any moment, what to pay attention to, what to foreground, what to background, and what would remain peripheral. And so it started out very simple, but I reached out to an animator and found one who would be willing to lay out in a very, very simple format. And we did a couple of chapters, and then I sent it to an animation instructor that I'd met at Mount Royal, and said, what do you think of this? And it was literally one line, and then gone. And he said, if you're trying to reproduce the mind, you could maybe make it a little bit more complicated. And that just totally triggered a switch in me. And the animator I was working with went to another project, and I found a guy in BC who did really great work. And we wound up with, at that time, 6 different 3 columns, something down at the bottom of the screen, something at the top of the screen, but basically 6 pieces of constantly changing text with the main action of the book happening over two things. And you're representing the action of the book and just other mental processes and things that are happening at that time. And it was really appealing. And then he wound up moving on to something else. And I wound up finding a third animator. And we wound up finding an ideal format, which was 3 columns in different colors in a letterbox format. 1 column represents pure, unprocessed information. 1 column represents intermediate information. And 1 column represents the book as it's being written in the guy's head. And over the course of about 6 or 7 months of trial and error, I mean, I'm probably on version 70 of this thing. We wound up coming up with something that I felt was visually appealing and that was complicated enough without being completely incomprehensible. And so we laid out 2 chapters. And this entire book has been a series of crises, solutions, retrenching. And over a couple of years, I'd been thinking about whether this project needed sound. And I was really wondering about what it would need. And you would remember I'm a record collector. And I was trying to think what kind of music would go with this. And so over about 6 months, every time I got a finished version of the file, I would play, I played everything I could think of over it, from the music of Leonin and Periton from the 11th century, which is very simple vocal music, through the early Baroque, through keyboard music, into the classical period. I skipped over the Romantics because I didn't think that would ever work, and then jazz, and then I was thinking of whether it would need to be all percussion, and everything. And then I realized that there was a composer I really admire who could really tell me. His name is Francisco Lopez. He's a Spaniard. He's a biologist and composer who has kind of recorded all around the world. He's done environmental recordings, composed his own electronic works, and I had about 47, 48 of his albums. And I thought, I decided it needed sound, and I decided that I should ask him what it would need. So I got his email off his website a few weeks ago and just sent him an email saying, I think this needs sound, and I think you would be the perfect person to be able to do it. And I asked him if he would be willing to license some of his recordings. And over, just a few days later, he wrote back to me and said that he'd be happy to work with the project, and that, that he'd be willing to compose new material for it. And he composes his own things. He will also take environmental recordings he's done, some of which are extraordinarily complicated, the rainforest, underwater, an insect hive, and he'll either run it raw or he'll process it, but it's extraordinarily complex music, rhythmically and harmonically. And to have him agree to do this was absolutely massive. So we scored the first couple of chapters and we're ready to go live. And it really is it's an interesting and very, very complex experience. So I'm really happy to be at this stage. It's nice and I'll just say this quickly. I've gone from a book that I was fooling around with that I would never finish to something that I felt was interesting enough that I was driven to push it to completion and a release. And it feels really good to be at this stage. I'm sorry for cutting you off, Kim.
No, sorry, I was cutting you off. Has this style been done before, or do you think this is a first?
In the history of visual art, there have been lots of artists who have worked with text. And the other thing is that the notion of using moving text to be able to put aside an image has been in common practice for decades and done extremely well by the advertising industry. And all you have to do is watch the first rolling credits of Star Wars, right? And what was it? In a place far away a long time ago, and you understand that this is in practice. I'm unaware of anything where someone has tried it for long form fiction. And especially in a multi-column format, I haven't quite been able to find anything like it. It's certainly unprecedented to me. It wouldn't surprise me if someone had tried it, but as the format for a long-form literary project, I'm unaware of anything, especially with something with sound. It's either unprecedented or certainly very unusual, and that feels good.
When will this project be released, do you think? And where will people be able to find it?
Well, we are hoping to roll it out in April 2022. The first couple of chapters that are scored, and I think I'm just gonna put it on YouTube and then begin marketing it and promoting it. And with the current format, between me and the animator, we are able to take my writing and animate it and then score it at about one chapter every 3 weeks to a month. And if we are able to, if it proves successful and we're able to do it on a full-time basis, we could likely get that down to a chapter every 2 weeks. So like I said, we've got 2 going up. If we're able to roll them, and the current format of the book calls for about 25 chapters, so about a year's work. Rolling it out, and we're hoping we'll be able to build an audience and see first of all if people like it. That's going to be the real thing I see, because it is a challenging format, but it is it's certainly an unusual one. And people had asked us whether we should just write the whole book and drop it, and I think we're at a stage where we really need to get it in front of some readers and get some feedback and see if it's coherent and if it's something that they find either enjoyable or informative in some way, if it has value to them, and kind of take their feedback and take that into consideration as we keep moving forward with the project.
I mean, your project sounds really exciting. Congratulations on getting it to the stage that you're at, and we'll look forward to when it's released. Just to finish the podcast, I'm wondering if you can give any advice to a university student graduating with a Bachelor of Arts moving into their life. Right.
I don't know if I have advice per se, but one thing I can tell you is that I would give this to really anybody, which is that be willing to be fluid and mobile, to adapt to opportunities, and understand that the thing that you really want to do, it is very possible that you may not know what it is yet, and be willing to make a lot of twists and turns and use trial and error to be able to find the thing that you want to do that will make you, that will, before you find that thing that you're excited enough about that it really doesn't seem like work. I mean, in my case, it took a number of different jobs, the arrival in a profession that I thought was going to be the one I wanted to stay in, that I found out later wasn't. And it's taken me a lot of years to find the project and the format that wound up being the thing that I wanted to do. And even once I found it, I had to work really hard and work through draft after draft, version after version, format after format, through multiple collaborators to be able to arrive at something that I felt would be, of enough value to be able to roll in front of the unsuspecting public. So it's, you need to be ready, be patient, be adaptable, and be never give up on it, and just keep working towards it. And there have been many times where I thought this thing is not going to happen, and I'm going to be left with nothing. And I was even willing to drop the project I've been working on and leave it with nothing, and facing a very uncertain future with it to be able to get to here. And so, be adaptable and always remain hopeful. I think that's the best way I could put it, Kim.
That is great advice. Davis, I just want to thank you for your time today.
Hey, Kim, thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Job Talk podcast. For more information, please visit us at thejobtalk.com.